The small restaurant sat on the corner of a busy street, squeezed between a phone repair shop and a closed clothing store. From the outside, it looked old and simple, but inside it felt warm. The lights were soft, the walls carried years of faded photos, and the smell of fresh food mixed with coffee filled the air. It was the kind of place where regulars were greeted with a nod, and newcomers quickly felt noticed that it was early evening, the time when people came in after long days at work. Some were tired, some were hungry, and some just wanted a quiet place to sit. Plates clinked, chairs moved, and low conversations floated through the room. Near the counter, a young waitress moved quickly between tables. Her steps were careful but fast. She carried 2 plates at once, balancing them like she had done 1,000 times before. Her face showed focus, but behind it sat worry. This shift mattered to her. Every shift mattered. She had been working there for months, saving small amounts from each paycheck. Some days were good, others were hard. Tips were never certain. Still, she smiled at every customer, even when her feet hurt and her back ached. She believed that kindness often returned when least expected. At a corner table close to the window, a man sat quietly with a small child. The child swung their legs under the chair, watching people pass outside. The man sipped his drink slowly, keeping one eye on the child and the other on the room. He wore simple clothes, clean but worn. His posture was calm, almost careful, like someone who had learned patience through life. He came to this place often, not because the food was special, but because it was peaceful. The staff knew him. They knew he never caused trouble, always paid on time, and sometimes left extra change if he could. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried weight. The waitress stopped by his table and placed a small plate in front of the child. The child smiled wide. "Thank you," the man said softly. She nodded and returned the smile before moving on. The door swung open suddenly, letting in loud voices and cool air. 4 young men walked in together. Their clothes were expensive, their shoes spotless. They spoke loudly, laughing as if the room belonged to them. Heads turned. Some customers glanced over, then looked away. They chose a table in the center of the restaurant, pulling chairs back without care. One leaned back before even sitting. Another checked his phone. The others joked loudly about something only they found funny. The waitress noticed them right away. She took a deep breath and walked over with a menu in her hand. "Good evening," she said politely. "Welcome." One of the boys barely looked at her. Another smirked and asked if the food was actually worth the price. The third laughed. The fourth scanned the room like he was bored already. She stayed calm and explained the menu. She answered questions, even when they interrupted her or spoke over each other. She wrote down their order carefully, repeating it back to avoid mistakes. They ordered more than most tables did. Extra sides, drinks, and desserts. As she walked away, their laughter followed her. From the corner table, the single dad watched quietly. He didn't stare, but he noticed. He noticed the way their voices cut through the room. He noticed how the waitress kept her shoulders straight, even when one of them snapped his fingers to get her attention. The food came out quickly. Plates were placed on the table, steam rising. For a moment, the boys were silent, busy eating. Then the comments started again. "This is it?" One said, "I've had better," another replied. They laughed, though they kept eating every bite. The waitress checked on them, asking if they needed anything. One of them asked for a different drink, then changed his mind. Another asked for more sauce, then said it was wrong. She apologized each time, even when it wasn't her fault. Other customers noticed the tension. A couple at a nearby table exchanged looks. An older man near the wall shook his head slightly. The manager stood behind the counter, watching, unsure whether to step in. The single dad's child leaned closer to him, and whispered something. He smiled softly and nodded, then guided the child back to the food. Time passed. Plates emptied. Drinks were finished. The waitress brought the check and placed it on the table with a polite smile. "Whenever you're ready," she said. The boys looked at the bill. One raised an eyebrow. Another leaned back in his chair. "This doesn't look right," he said loudly. She stepped closer, her hands folded in front of her. "Is there something wrong?" The boy tapped the paper. "The service wasn't great." She blinked. "I'm sorry if you feel that way. We had to ask for things twice," another added. "Though it wasn't true. And the food took too long," said a third. The fourth laughed and said, "Yeah, why should we pay full price for that?" Her heart began to race. She kept her voice steady. "I can ask the manager to—" "No," one of them cut in. "We're not paying." The room went quiet. Conversation stopped. Forks paused midair. She stood there, frozen for a moment. Her mind raced. If the bill wasn't paid, it might come out of her paycheck. She thought of rent, of groceries, of the long hours she had worked that week. "I'll get the manager," she said softly. As she turned to walk away, one of the boys laughed. "Good luck with that." The manager approached the table carefully, speaking in a low voice. The boys talked over him, their voices rising again. They pointed at the bill, at the waitress, at the plates. The single dad shifted in his chair. He watched the waitress stand near the counter, her hands shaking slightly as she tried to stay composed. He looked at his child, then back at the table in the center of the room. He didn't move yet. He just watched, listening. The boys continued talking loudly, acting as if the entire restaurant was their audience. The waitress kept her head down, blinking back tears she refused to let fall. The man in the corner exhaled slowly. He placed his hand gently on the table and stood up. The chair scraped softly against the floor as he turned toward the center of the room. The waitress's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the manager, trying not to draw more attention. She had faced rude customers before, but there was something about these four that made her stomach twist with worry. They weren't just impatient. They seemed to believe that their money gave them the right to treat people however they wanted. Their laughter echoed through the small restaurant, and even some of the regular customers looked away, unsure of what to do. The manager stepped forward, placing a calm hand on the edge of the counter. He cleared his throat and said in a steady voice, "Gentlemen, the check is correct. The service was standard for our restaurant. I can explain anything if you wish." One of the boys smirked and waved a dismissive hand. "Nah, it's fine. We just don't think it's worth paying. This is ridiculous. Can you imagine paying for this?" He gestured toward the empty plates. Another chimed in, louder this time, seriously. "We've eaten better at home. Why should we pay for this?" He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed like a king sitting on a throne. The waitress swallowed hard, feeling her face flush. She wanted to speak up, to tell them they were wrong, that she had worked hard for hours to make sure their orders were right. But she didn't dare. Not when she was alone in front of four people who clearly didn't care about anyone else. The manager tried again. "Please, I understand your concerns, but the bill is correct. The young woman serving you has done her job properly. If there's an issue, we can resolve it politely." The boys laughed louder, as if the manager's words were a joke. One of them leaned forward on the table, resting his chin on his hands, and said, "Polite? Yeah, that's cute. But we don't need to be polite. We don't have to pay if we don't want to." The waitress felt tears prick the corners of her eyes. She clenched her fists behind her back, trying to calm herself. Every rule she knew about professionalism was colliding with the fear of losing money she didn't have. She glanced at the corner where the single dad was sitting with his child, quietly observing everything. Something about the way he watched made her feel a little less alone. He didn't look angry. He just looked ready. One of the boys reached for his phone, pretending to call someone, probably to show off. Another tapped the table, smirking at the waitress as if daring her to speak. The tension in the restaurant was growing, and the other customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some whispered quietly, but no one intervened yet. The manager's voice remained calm, but his shoulders tightened. "I think we can resolve this without any trouble. It's just a meal. Please, let's be fair." The boys laughed again, louder this time, making the manager pause. They were enjoying this, feeding off the discomfort they caused. Finally, one of the boys stood up, towering over the waitress. He pointed at the bill with his phone in hand, showing the amount. "Look at this. This is what we're paying for? This is ridiculous. We could get something better anywhere else. Why should we pay?" The waitress felt her chest tighten. She wanted to scream, to tell them to leave. She wanted to demand respect, but she couldn't. She had learned the hard way that sometimes the world wasn't fair, and sometimes the people in front of you had no reason to be decent. Her gaze flicked again to the single dad. He had stood up now, slowly, but with a quiet confidence that didn't belong to someone who had just been sitting and watching. His child clutched his hand tightly, watching curiously. There was a calmness in him that made the boy's arrogance feel suddenly. Small Dot the boys didn't notice him at first. They were too busy arguing and laughing at each other, thinking they were untouchable. They leaned over the table, throwing sarcastic comments, mocking her and her service. The waitress took a step back, swallowing hard. Her heart pounded in her chest. She knew she couldn't make them leave on her own. She had no power here. Her voice was weak when she spoke. "Please, you can't do this. It's the right thing to pay for the meal." One of the boys laughed and shook his head. "Right thing? You really think this matters to us?" He waved his hand dismissively. "We're not paying. End of story." Her hands clenched into fists. She wanted to cry, but held herself together. She had to. Not just for her, but for the restaurant, for the staff who counted on her, for every customer who might walk in and witness this. She took a slow breath, trying to steady herself. The single dad took another step forward, his voice calm but firm. "Excuse me," he said softly, not loud but enough to draw attention. The boys looked at him, their expressions changing from amusement to mild curiosity. He continued, "I've been sitting here watching, and I think you should reconsider. You can argue all you want, but the person in front of you worked hard to serve you. She didn't deserve the way you've treated her." The boys glanced at each other, smirking as if this was a joke. One of them said, "Who are you? Some random guy trying to tell us what to do?" He didn't raise his voice. He just looked at them evenly. "I'm someone who understands hard work. I raise my child alone. I work long hours, and I know the value of earning an honest living. She's doing the same. Respect costs nothing, but it can teach you a lot." The laughter from the boys faltered slightly. The restaurant had gone quiet. Customers leaned forward, listening. The air felt heavy. One boy finally sneered, "What are you going to do about it?" The single dad didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone made the boys pause. "Nothing. I don't need to do anything. But maybe think about what kind of people you want to be. Do you want to leave this place thinking you're better than everyone else? Or do you want to act like humans with decency?" For a moment, the boys looked confused. Their laughter had vanished. No one spoke. The manager shifted nervously, unsure if he should step in or let this play out. The waitress stood frozen, unsure if she should cry or smile. One of the boys finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. "Whatever. It's just a meal." The single dad's child tugged gently on his hand. He knelt down and whispered something softly to the child, then stood again, turning back to the table. "Just a meal?" he asked, softly but pointedly. "To you, maybe. But to someone else, it's their livelihood. It's their day, their effort, and that effort deserves respect." The silence in the restaurant grew. Some customers nodded slightly. Others whispered quietly to each other. Even the manager's jaw tightened. The boys shuffled their feet, exchanging nervous glances. The sense of superiority they had carried in like a shield now felt weaker. They looked at the bill again, and at the waitress. For the first time, they noticed the exhaustion in her face, the tension in her shoulders, the human being behind the service. One boy muttered under his breath, "Maybe we went too far." The others were silent. The single dad didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. His calm had shifted the energy in the room. Respect, patience, and quiet strength spoke louder than arrogance ever could. The waitress exhaled slowly, relief washing over her in small waves. She had felt helpless moments ago, but now, with him standing there, she felt hope. She looked at him, her lips trembling slightly in a quiet smile. The boys were still there, but their bravado was gone. Their laughter had stopped. They stared at the single dad, unsure of what to say or how to act. The atmosphere in the restaurant had changed. What had begun as an uncomfortable confrontation was turning into a quiet lesson, not from anger, but from someone who understood struggle and stood with dignity. It was a long evening. But in those moments, the balance had shifted. The waitress had gained a small reprieve. The boys had been reminded that money doesn't buy respect, and the single dad had quietly made a difference without raising his voice or demanding attention. The room was still tense, but the lesson had begun to settle. The four rich boys were no longer untouchable. They had been reminded that their actions affected others, and someone who had nothing to prove could teach them more than they expected. The waitress stood near the counter, shaking slightly but proud. She had survived the hardest part of the night. She had witnessed something rare, a quiet act of courage that spoke louder than anger or confrontation. The single dad returned to his table, kneeling briefly to check on his child, who smiled up at him. The moment was simple, yet meaningful. Life was not always fair, but sometimes small acts of standing up for others could shift the world around you. The boys were still there, but the silence weighed on them. They had come in thinking they were untouchable, but now the restaurant felt different. Their laughter was gone, replaced by the uncomfortable weight of self-awareness. And in that moment, the waitress realized something. Sometimes help doesn't roar. Sometimes it simply arrives quietly, standing behind you when you need it most. The restaurant had fallen into an uneasy quiet. The clatter of plates and cutlery had slowed. Conversations from other tables had dulled, and even the hum of the air conditioner seemed softer. The four young men sat at their table, shuffling papers and staring at the empty plates before them. Their confidence had faded slightly, replaced by confusion and an unfamiliar feeling awkwardness. They looked around the room, noticing for the first time that people were watching them. Some with quiet disapproval, others with silent curiosity. The single dad stood near his table, his hand lightly resting on the back of his child's chair. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He simply waited for the right moment. And when he spoke, his voice was calm but firm, carrying across the small space without needing to raise in anger. "You know," he began, addressing the four boys directly, "I've seen a lot of people act like they own the world because of money. I've seen people think respect can be bought with a card swipe. But respect isn't bought. It's earned. And it's given freely when you treat others like human beings." One of the boys laughed nervously, leaning back in his chair. "And who are you to tell us that? Some guy with a kid?" The single dad met his eyes steadily. Yes, a man with a child. A man who works long hours every day, who struggles to make ends meet, who understands the value of honest work. And I'm telling you this because I've seen what happens when people like you forget that there are consequences to treating others badly. The boys exchanged glances, unsure if they should laugh or walk away. The energy that had once made them feel invincible was slowly draining, replaced by the weight of the stare of someone who had nothing to prove. The waitress, still near the counter, watched with wide eyes. She felt a mixture of hope and disbelief. Could one person really change the course of a situation like this? Could one man, quietly standing there, really make these arrogant young men reconsider themselves? She had seen strangers speak up before, but none with such calm authority. The single dad took a step closer to their table, careful not to be threatening, just assertive. Look around you, he continued. Everyone in this room has worked, in one way or another, for what they have. Some more, some less, but we all contribute in ways that matter. She served you tonight. She carried your meals, made sure your drinks were filled, and smiled while you mocked her. That's effort. That's work. That deserves something better than disrespect. One of the boys, fidgeting with his phone, muttered, "Whatever, it's just a meal." The single dad shook his head slightly, a quiet sadness in his eyes. It's never just a meal. To her, it's her job, her livelihood. It's what she depends on to feed herself and her family. It's the hours she puts in so she can keep going. And when you treat her like she doesn't matter, that's not just a small thing. It's a statement about who you think you are in the world. And I think you're better than that, even if you don't believe it right now. The air in the restaurant seemed to shift. Customers leaned forward, watching intently. Even the manager paused behind the counter, trying not to interfere, but unable to hide a small sense of relief. Finally, someone was saying aloud what everyone else in the room was thinking, that what the boys were doing was wrong. One of the boys, clearly uncomfortable, muttered something under his breath. The single dad didn't need to hear the words to know what had been said. He continued, unflinching. I've raised my child alone. I've worked days that feel endless and nights when sleep is a luxury. And every day I've learned that kindness, honesty, and respect matter more than money ever will. If you can't see that now, maybe you will one day. But tonight, you have a choice. You can leave here thinking you're better than everyone else. Or you can do what's right and show that maybe, just maybe, you have some understanding of what it means to be decent. The boys looked at each other again. Their bravado was gone. Their laughter had disappeared. They could feel the weight of the room on their shoulders, the quiet judgment of the people around them, the seriousness in the voice of the man standing in front of them, the trembling hope in the eyes of the young woman they had been tormenting. The single dad took another step forward, lowering his voice slightly so it carried intimacy and sincerity rather than anger. I'm not here to humiliate you. I'm here to remind you that your actions matter, that your words matter, that every choice, every small decision you make leaves an impression on the people around you. And right now, you have the chance to make a better choice. One of the boys finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. And what? What if we just leave? The single dad didn't flinch. He didn't need to. Then you leave having learned nothing. But if you stay, you can choose to leave having learned something about yourself, something you might carry forward for the rest of your life. There was a long pause. The waitress held her breath, unsure of what would happen next. Would the boys storm out, angry and dismissive as before, or would they, for once, consider the words being spoken? The manager stepped forward slightly, his presence silent but supportive. He didn't say anything, but the boys could see him watching, waiting to see if they would act like decent people. Finally, One of the boys shifted in his chair, looking at the bill again. The amount didn't matter anymore. The confrontation wasn't about money. It was about something bigger. About respect, about recognizing effort, about understanding that life wasn't just a game to be won by wealth and arrogance. The single dad nodded once, acknowledging their silent contemplation. He didn't push, didn't demand. He simply waited, giving them the space to make a choice. The boys exchanged glances again, their expressions a mix of embarrassment, guilt, and confusion. None of them had ever been confronted like this before. None of them had ever been made to feel small without being insulted or mocked. And in that silence, they realized something. The world didn't revolve around them, and sometimes it demanded humility. The waitress felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had been scared, trembling with fear and frustration. But now there was hope. Maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't end in humiliation or loss. Maybe there was a chance for justice, even if it was small. The single dad returned his gaze to his child for a moment, kneeling down to adjust the chair and ensure the little one was comfortable. Then he stood again, facing the boys fully. "It's up to you," he said simply. "But remember, choices define who we are. Not money, not status, not power. Only the choices we make when no one is looking or when everyone is watching truly define us." Another long pause followed. The boys fidgeted, uncertain, their usual confidence gone. The room was quiet, filled with anticipation. Even the hum of the air conditioner seemed louder in the silence. Finally, the youngest of the group spoke, his voice almost a whisper. Maybe we should just pay." The single dad nodded slightly, not smugly, not triumphantly, but with quiet satisfaction. He didn't gloat, didn't lecture. He simply gave them the space to do the right thing. The other boys looked at him, then at the bill, then at the waitress. Slowly, almost reluctantly, one of them reached for his wallet. Another followed. And then, with small, hesitant gestures, the group began to pull out their cards and cash, settling the bill. The waitress exhaled deeply, tears pricking her eyes. Relief and gratitude washed over her. She nodded toward the single dad, unable to find the words to express her thanks. He simply smiled faintly, the kind of smile that came from knowing you had done the right thing without needing recognition. The other customers in the restaurant breathed a little easier. Conversations resumed quietly, and the clatter of plates returned. Life, in its ordinary rhythm, began to flow again. The single dad returned to his table, kneeling briefly to check on his child, who smiled up at him. The lesson had been taught without anger, without shouting, but with presence, dignity, and quiet authority. The four boys sat at their table, their hands empty, their pride slightly bruised. But they had learned something they hadn't expected that evening. It was a lesson about respect, humility, and the power of quiet courage. And the waitress, standing near the counter, finally let herself smile. She had faced a situation that could have ended in despair, but instead, it ended with a reminder that kindness and courage could change even the most difficult moments. The single dad didn't linger. He returned to his child, taking their hand and leading them quietly toward the door. The restaurant had returned to normal, but the lesson lingered. The moment had changed something, not just for the boys, but for everyone who had witnessed it. Sometimes life doesn't shout its lessons. Sometimes it whispers them through simple acts of courage, through quiet strength, and through people who choose to stand up for what is right when it matters most. The atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted completely. The clatter of dishes and low hum of conversation had returned, but there was a new quiet understanding in the room. The four young men sat at their table, hands resting uneasily on the edges, staring down at the bill they had finally paid. Their faces showed a mix of embarrassment, uncertainty, and a dawning awareness that they had misbehaved. The waitress stood behind the counter, trying to steady her breathing. Her hands were no longer trembling, but her chest still felt tight. Relief washed over her, mixed with a sense of pride. She had watched the single dad quietly handle the situation, and she felt grateful beyond words. She had been terrified, thinking she might lose her income or face more humiliation. But now, everything seemed to have shifted. The single dad returned to his table, gently taking his child's hand. He knelt down for a moment, smiling at the small face looking up at him. "You are very patient," he whispered softly, ruffling the child's hair. The little one smiled and nodded, unaware of the tension that had just passed, but feeling the calm that radiated from their parent. Then he stood and looked around the restaurant again. He noticed the customers who had witnessed the scene. Some nodded slightly, offering small smiles of appreciation. Others whispered quietly to each other, commenting on the courage it took to stand up like that. The man's presence had not only changed the table at the center of the room, but also reminded everyone else that respect and decency mattered. Even in small places, the four boys were still seated, their silence heavy in the air. One of them finally shifted, his chair scraping lightly against the floor. I guess we weren't really thinking," he said softly, almost to himself. The single dad looked toward him, calm and patient. "It's not always easy to see the effects of your actions until someone points them out. That's normal. The important thing is that you recognize it and choose to do better." Another of the boys, who had been fidgeting with his phone, finally put it down and looked at the waitress. He hesitated, then spoke. I'm sorry for how we treated you. That was unfair." The waitress blinked, caught off guard. She had expected nothing, had braced for insults or anger, and now she was hearing a simple, quiet apology. She nodded slowly, her lips trembling slightly. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means a lot." The single dad remained nearby, observing silently. He didn't need to say anything more. The boys were beginning to understand, beginning to take responsibility in their own way. The lesson he had delivered quietly, without anger, was beginning to take hold. The manager finally stepped forward, his voice calm and steady. "Thank you," he said to the single dad. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't intervened." The man shook his head gently. "It wasn't about me. It was about reminding them what respect looks like, and about showing her that she isn't alone." The manager nodded, clearly moved. "Well, you've done more than that. You've reminded all of us what kindness and patience can do." The four boys at the table were still quiet, but the tension between them had shifted. They weren't joking anymore. The arrogance that had filled the room was gone, replaced by something quieter, more uncertain, but real. They were seeing the consequences of their behavior, not just through words, but through the reactions of everyone around them. One of the boys spoke again, his voice small but steady. "I don't think we realized how much our actions mattered. We didn't think about her or the work she was doing." The single dad nodded slowly. "It's easy not to think about others when we're used to thinking only of ourselves. That's part of growing up. But the moment you begin to notice and care, that's when real change starts." The waitress finally took a small step forward. "It's okay," she said softly. "We all make mistakes. I appreciate that you apologized. That matters more than anything else." One of the boys looked at her and smiled awkwardly. "We will try to do better next time, and we'll remember this." The single dad nodded approvingly. "Good. That's all anyone can ask for. The important thing is learning from mistakes and making better choices in the future." He glanced around the restaurant once more. He could see the subtle nods from other customers, the small smiles that said they, too, had felt the weight of what had happened. What had started as a confrontation over a bill had turned into a moment that reminded everyone present of empathy, patience, and courage. The boys were shifting in their chairs again, clearly uncomfortable, but also reflective. They had been confronted, not with anger or shouting, but with calm, steady words that made them reconsider. They had been reminded that their money did not make them better, that respect was earned through actions, not assumed through wealth. The single dad returned to his table with his child, kneeling to adjust their chair. "You see," he said softly, "sometimes the people who seem quiet or small are the ones with the greatest strength. It's not about yelling or showing off. It's about standing firm, being fair, and caring about others." The child looked up at him, eyes wide, then nodded. The little one didn't understand everything, but they could feel the calm, the quiet authority, and the reassurance. The waitress took a deep breath and returned to her station. She had faced her fear, and with the help of someone willing to stand up, had come through it. She felt a small smile creeping across her face. The tension in her shoulders began to ease, and for the first time in hours, she felt a genuine sense of relief that the boys had not left yet. But the atmosphere around their table was completely different. They were no longer loud or mocking. Their conversation was quiet, hesitant, as if they were processing what had just happened. Their earlier arrogance had been replaced by reflection, and though they were still learning, they were learning in a way that would stay with them longer than any lecture or punishment ever could. The single dad stood and adjusted his coat, preparing to leave. He gave a small nod toward the waitress, who returned it with a look of gratitude that needed no words. He collected his child's hand and walked slowly toward the door, leaving behind more than just payment for his meal. He left behind a quiet lesson, one that would echo in the minds of the boys and the other customers for a long time. As he reached the door, one of the boys called out, "Hey, sir, thank you for everything." The single dad paused, turning slightly with a faint smile. "Remember what you learned. That's more important than any thanks." And with that, he stepped outside, holding his child's hand, leaving the restaurant in peace. Inside, the waitress exhaled slowly, finally allowing herself to release the tension she had been holding. She felt stronger, braver, knowing that even in the hardest moments, help could come in unexpected ways. The manager watched the scene, silently grateful for the man who had stepped in. The four boys remained seated for a while, quietly discussing the evening, no longer loud or dismissive. They had been reminded that life was bigger than money, bigger than status, bigger than showing off. And in that quiet reflection, a change had begun. The restaurant returned to its normal rhythm. Plates clattered, chairs scraped, and low conversation resumed. Yet, the memory of what had just occurred lingered. It had been a small place, a quiet moment, but it had carried a lesson far larger than the room itself. The boys eventually left, paying their bill fully and adding a generous tip for the waitress. It was more than just money. It was acknowledgement, respect, and a gesture that showed they had begun to understand the value of empathy. The waitress smiled, tears pricking her eyes. She had faced a challenge that could have ended badly, and instead, it had ended with respect, humility, and a reminder that courage could come quietly, without anger, without shouting, just with presence and belief in what is right. The single dad had left the restaurant, but his impact remained. The boys would remember that evening for years to come. The waitress would remember it too, as a moment of reassurance and strength. And the customers who had witnessed it would carry the lesson silently with them. A reminder that one person, standing calmly and firmly, could make a difference in the world, even small places. Small acts and quiet courage could create lasting change. That evening, the lesson had been learned. And though it had started with conflict, it ended with understanding, reflection, and a reminder of what it truly means to treat others with dignity. The restaurant had returned to its normal rhythm, the quiet buzz of conversation and the soft clatter of dishes filling the room again. But for the waitress, the memory of the four boys and the single dad lingered in a way that made the evening feel larger than usual. She had spent the last hour replaying every moment, from the boy's arrogance to the calm presence of the man who had stood up for her. It was a story that would stay with her, one of courage, patience, and human kindness. The four boys had left earlier, their heads slightly lowered, their voices quieter than when they arrived. They had paid the bill and even left a generous tip. It was not the tip alone that mattered. It was the acknowledgement, the act of correcting themselves after realizing their mistake. They had learned something they hadn't expected that night. The lesson wasn't just about money. It was about respect, empathy, and seeing people as human beings rather than obstacles or entertainment. The waitress wiped down tables, moving slowly as she reflected on what had just happened. She felt a mix of relief and gratitude. Relief because the night hadn't ended in conflict or humiliation, and gratitude because someone had stepped up when she had felt powerless. She knew that standing up for oneself was important, but sometimes having someone support you in a moment of need made all the difference. The manager approached her quietly, giving her a small nod. "You did well tonight," he said softly. "I know it was hard, but you handled it with professionalism." And he, the man who spoke up, he reminded us all what really matters. She smiled faintly, nodding. "I never expected anyone to step in like that. I didn't know what I would have done alone." The manager shook his head. Not everyone has the courage to do what he did. Sometimes just being present, speaking calmly, is more powerful than yelling or arguing. She took a deep breath, feeling a little lighter. For weeks, she had worried about serving difficult customers, about rude behavior and disrespect. But that night reminded her that while not everyone would act decently, there were people willing to stand up for what was right, quietly and without seeking recognition. Outside, the single dad walked down the street holding his child's hand. The little one chattered happily about the evening, unaware of the tension that had filled the restaurant, but enjoying the warmth of being with a parent who had remained calm and strong. He listened patiently, nodding and laughing at the child's observations, knowing that moments like this were the threads that built trust, understanding, and a sense of security. He thought about the four boys, and he hoped that the lesson would stay with them. Not just the lesson about paying for a meal, but the deeper one about how to treat others with respect, how to notice the effort that goes into simple acts, and how to understand that wealth or status never makes someone more valuable than another human being. The impact of that quiet moment in the restaurant could ripple far beyond the walls of that small space. The next day, at the restaurant, the energy was different. The staff talked quietly about what had happened. Some customers had come back, mentioning they had witnessed the event and appreciated how the situation was handled. The waitress felt a renewed sense of purpose. She realized that kindness and courage, even in small moments, could make a big difference. She smiled more easily that day, carrying the confidence that she wasn't alone when facing difficult situations. Weeks later, the four boys returned to the area, not to the restaurant immediately, but they carried the memory with them. In conversations with friends, they found themselves recounting what had happened, each time reflecting more on the lesson than on the embarrassment. They realized that their money had never protected them from consequences, and that genuine respect was earned through behavior, not assumed through privilege. The evening in the restaurant became a turning point, a quiet moment that taught them humility and awareness of others. For the single dad, life continued as it always had, with work, parenting, and small challenges. But that night stayed in his mind as a reminder that sometimes the most ordinary people could create extraordinary change. He didn't seek attention or praise, but he understood the power of presence, of calm authority, and of standing for others when it mattered most. The waitress continued to serve customers with the same care and dedication as before, but with a new sense of resilience. She felt stronger, more confident in her ability to handle difficult situations. She had witnessed how courage, quiet and deliberate, could shift the balance in even the most tense moments. And she knew that the lesson went beyond the restaurant. It applied to life itself, to treat people with dignity, to stand up when possible, and to act with kindness even when it seemed no one was watching.